But when I was a student in Rome, I would often visit the Church of the Gesù, which is the primary Jesuit church in Rome. It's located right in the middle of the historical center of Rome, and kind of on the way to the Gregorian University that we would walk, and Deacon knows the route there. And in this church is a stunning crucifix. It's life-sized, it's made of wood, and what is unique about this crucifix is that the body is hung at eye level, so that what grabs your attention is the open wound of Jesus' side. And it's this wooden depiction of the wound. It's grimy and worn from literally hundreds of thousands of people through the last few centuries putting their fingers in there, putting their hands into his side. And I remember often pausing and imagining these people with their struggles, their pains, their sufferings in life, who were drawn to the open side of Christ. Those people were responding to that invitation of Jesus that we remember from the Gospel of St. John. He said to Thomas, "Put your fingers into the nail marks and your hand into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believe." In Jesus crucified, we see the nails piercing his hands, his feet, the open gash in his chest from the soldier's lance, a victim of human sinfulness and cruelty. Now, do you ever wonder why Jesus still has his wounds after the resurrection? I mean, wouldn't it be better if Jesus showed up in the upper room like all better, like all healed, and conclude they couldn't even leave a scratch, much less a scar, right? Wouldn't it be a powerful sign of how victorious he was? But when he appears to his apostles, they aren't closed up. In fact, he invited the apostles to touch them. This is a very great and bright mystery. You know, there's some sound theological reasons why Jesus' wounds don't close in the resurrection. Great thinkers from the fathers of the church, St. Thomas Aquinas, argue that these open wounds are signs that the resurrection is real, that the body that was crucified is the same body that was raised from the dead. The wounds are trophies of Jesus' victory over death as he pleads before the Father on our behalf as our ultimate high priest, showing the manner of our redemption. These wounds are signs of his infinite love for us. And at the judgment, they will show the condemnation of the damned for those who rejected the love that these wounds reveal. Today, rather than kind of delving deeper and exploring these theological reasons, I'd like to probe the mystery of the wounds of Christ more spiritually and personally, and looking at this main idea. Jesus' open wounds in his resurrected body invite us to draw close to him with our wounds so that he can transform them. Those still open wounds are central to the accounts of the resurrection. The Thomas incident is probably the most famous, but today we hear it from St. Luke. Then he said to them, "Why are you troubled? Why do questions arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, because a ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you can see I have." And as he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. What is significant about Jesus' wounds in his resurrected body and glorified body is that these wounds have changed. His wounds are now transformed. They're no longer bleeding and a source of suffering. They're not getting infected and burning reminders of a very bad day. Right? Think of what he says to St. Thomas, "Put your finger here, put your hand into my side." Right? What is it when we cut ourselves deeply or when we have some sort of accident? Do we tell the person next to us, "Please put your hand in here"? Right? It's like, no, our instinctive reaction is to cover up, right? To guard, to protect. In his resurrected body, those wounds have now become a living source of healing, forgiveness, and mercy opened up to the whole world. Jesus shows his apostles that his hands and his side, and he says, whose sins you forgive are forgiven. He's instructing them, see, now take this power out into the world. And St. Peter, who will be primary in carrying out that work of forgiveness and mercy for the world, will tell us simply as possible in his first letter. By his wounds you have been healed. So in the divine plan, the wounds don't just disappear. Instead, they remain open, but transformed as a sign of the resurrection and as a font of mercy for the world. So what does this mean for us? Every human being, to some degree or another, also carries wounds in our bodies and our souls. Often these wounds are the result of other people's sinfulness, traumatic and sinful behavior which is inflicted upon us, especially in the vulnerability of childhood, that can destroy innocence and purity, render trust difficult, creating wounds that we bear in our body and spirit as we get older. Obvious examples of physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse. There can be wounds of abandonment through divorce, having an emotionally distant father or mother, anger or violence in the home, addictions, alcohol, drugs, being sexualized at a young age by exposure to pornography and bad media, not having parents who protected their children's innocence. And there's also patterns of generational woundedness that get passed down from generation to generation until someone in the link gets healed. Sometimes our wounds are self-inflicted from our own sinful choices, our bad habits, and the compromises that we make with them. Our own sinful choices and bad decisions wound us and can bring about even more shame and misery. And some wounds don't seem to have a direct cause due to anyone's fault. They come as rather the result of living in a fallen world, a world that is distant from God. We experience all sorts of traumatic and difficult circumstances, natural disasters, the sickness of a parent, the death of a loved one, mental illness, poverty, disease, death, isolation. In these cases, it doesn't seem anyone is directly at fault. It's just the reality of living in this fallen world. And not understanding that property can also lead to other wounds in our hearts and souls. Ultimately, most of these wounds we experience in life lead us to a deep sense and even an identity of being unloved or being unlovable. And a lot of time, people's behavior and actions flow from that corrupted identity, that wounded identity, compulsive lust or anger, alcohol abuse, self-destructive behavior, self-sabotage in life. So often we live out of that false and wounded identity. And if these wounds aren't healed, they fester. Right? They don't naturally get better over time. That healing always requires work. And in this regard, I was reminded by a passage from one of C.S. Lewis's short novels called The Great Divorce. It's a wonderful read. I'm not going to tell you the whole background, but the basic idea of the part of the story I want to share with you is that these souls, which Lewis says are ghosts, they get the opportunity to journey from hell to heaven. But it takes some work for them. And so the narrator of the story, who's going through this kind of like a modern-day Dante, he tells the story of this one ghost who has a red lizard of lust on his shoulder. And here's what the narrator says. He says, "I saw coming toward us a ghost who carried something on his shoulder. What sat on his shoulder was a little red lizard, and it was twitching its tail like a whip and whispering things in his ear. And as we caught sight of him, he turned his head to the reptile with a snarl of impatience. 'Shut up, I tell you.' It wagged its tail and continued to whisper to him, And then the ghost ceased snarling and presently began to smile, and then turned and started to walk back towards hell. And then at that moment, an angel appears, right, to help people on the journey to heaven. The angel says, "Would you like me to make him quiet?" referring to the lizard thing. "Of course I would," said the ghost. "Then I will kill him," said the angel, taking a step forward. And the ghost is conflicted, right? Debate ensues. The ghost is afraid that he'll die in the process of killing this little lizard of lust he's been carrying around for most of his life. Right? It's kind of become part of who he is, of his identity. And finally he relents, admitting that it would be better to die than to continue on with this thing. So back to the story. The burning one closed his crimson grip on the reptile, twisted it while it bit and writhed, and then flung it, broken backed, on the turf. The ghost gave a scream of agony such as I have never heard on earth. "Ow, that's done for me," gasped the ghost, reeling backwards. And this ghost, whom the narrator had described as a dark and oily creature, is now transformed into a man, golden and bright. But what I love about the scene, and this is what C.S. Lewis is so insightful in his story, is that what happens to this disgusting little lizard his back has been broken on the ground. At first I thought the operation had failed. So far from dying, the creature was still struggling and even growing bigger as it struggled. And as it grew, it changed. And suddenly I started back rubbing my eyes. What stood before me was the greatest stallion I had ever seen. Silvery white, but with mane and tail of gold. It was smooth and shining, rippled with swells of flesh and muscle, whinnying and stamping its hooves. At each stamp the land shook and the trees dindled. The new-made man turned and clapped the new horse's neck. It nosed its bright body. Horse and master breathed into each other's nostrils. Then in joyous haste, the young man leapt upon the horse's back. Turning his seat, he waved a farewell and nudged the stallion with its heels. They were off before I knew what was happening. They were like a shooting star far off in the green plain and soon among the foothills of the mountains. Then, still like a star, I saw them winding up, scaling what seemed impossible steeps, and quicker every movement, until near the dim brow of the landscape, so high that I must strain my neck to see them, they vanished, bright themselves, into the rose brightness of that everlasting morning. The little lizard, who had been like a parasite sucking the life out of the man, is now transformed painfully to become this charger he rides now to heaven. This is a great image for how God can transform our wounds to become powerful vessels of divine love that actually propel us more deeply into the divine life and into divine love. When our wounds are transformed in the wounds of Jesus Christ, they are different. The wounds which we thought made us distant from God and His love are now made into vessels of His love and mercy, out of which pours out divine love and mercy into the world. Yes, wounded people wound other people, but healed people heal other people. You know, one concrete example of someone whose wounds were healed by Christ, transformed, is St. Mary Magdalene. You know, St. Mary Magdalene seems to have been a public sinner until she met Jesus. Scripture tells us little about her. St. Luke says that Jesus cast out 7 demons from her. Now, whether that means a numeric 7 of exorcism of 7 demons, or 7 in the figurative sense, being completely perfectly overcome by the devil. That's open to speculation. But in any case, before meeting our master, she was very much a prisoner in the kingdom of darkness. Perhaps she's the woman caught in adultery whom Jesus saves from stoning. Perhaps she's the sinful woman who bathes Jesus' feet with her tears and wipes them with her hair. And this would make sense since the scriptures indicate a connection between St. Mary Magdalene and Jesus' body. Perhaps she's the Mary who's the sister of Lazarus. And for these reasons and for others, the tradition has sensed that Jesus freed Mary of Magdala from a life of sensuality. And perhaps her life of public sin had in the background the wounds that we have already mentioned. And her own sinful choices wounded her even more. Even so, we see something incredible happen to Mary. She's freed from the seven demons. And then she remains utterly faithful to her Lord, even standing with Our Lady and St. John at the foot of the cross. She who had been deep in sin could now grieve right next to the sinless mother. She who had lived in the slavery of the flesh could now purely and gently touch the dead flesh of her Lord when he had been taken down from the cross. She becomes one of the first witnesses of the resurrection, one of the first to believe, and one of the first to announce the resurrection. She who had been so distant from him became one of his most intimate friends. Clearly, her wounds had been transformed, and she became one of the church's most revered saints. Her wounds, when brought into the wounds of Jesus, were healed and transformed. And here's the thing, not forgetting C.S. Lewis, made her a great saint. These wounds are in the wounds of Christ and transformed. They become the vehicles of holiness. And what the Lord wants to heal most of all is anything in us that would prevent us from receiving his love or giving our love in return. So think for a moment. What in your soul makes you feel unloved or unlovable? Where's the shame? Where's the discouragement? Where do you despise yourself? What in your soul is impeding your ability to receive the unconditional love of the Father and to respond to that love? What in your soul is impeding your ability to give your love to him and to others? These are the wounds that need to come to Jesus Christ. Bring these wounds to his open side. The wellspring of all grace and healing is pouring out from this tabernacle, this altar, this sanctuary, right now and at every Mass. Let this river flow into us and through us. And to that end, I want to encourage us to read a fantastic book by Dr. Bob Schuchts called Be Healed. Some of you know of that book from having gone to confession. The full title is called Be Healed, a guide to encountering the powerful love of Jesus in your life. He's a Catholic psychologist and the founder of the John Paul II Healing Center in Florida. And his book is a concrete pathway to healing those wounds we have been carrying around for far too long. He also has a podcast called Restore the Glory, if you like podcasts more than books. And another one at the JP2 Center for Healing is Carrie Schuchts-Dant, who has a book especially for women called Undone, Freeing Your Feminine Heart from Knots of Fear and Shame. Jesus wants to heal and transform our wounds and to make us glorious in them. Our wounds, when brought to the wounds of Christ, can be changed from a wicked lizard to a mighty stallion that will propel us into the fullness of divine life. Jesus invites us to put our grimy fingers into his glorious side and be healed.